Tudor Crime and Punishment in 15 minutes. The Tudor era began in 1485 with Henry VII and ended in 1603 with his granddaughter Elizabeth I. In the 16th century, there wasn't a police force. There was no way of discovering who perpetrated crime other than by witnesses and torture. Punishment was severe. Human rights as a concept was many hundreds of years in the waiting. There was no legal aid and no welfare state. Defendants were not allowed legal counsel, and to be accused of a crime was almost a conviction, as the accused was deemed guilty until proven innocent. Further, each crime had different punishments, and that crime and punishment also depended on your social status. The court system itself was sorted into three rough groups: the King's Courts, which primarily handled political and financial crimes and reflecting royal interests; the Church Courts, which sought social control and to mould human behaviour, focusing on punishing sin and immoral behaviour such as adultery; and the Local Courts, which handled secular, local problems such as land disputes. The courts were not unified into a single hierarchical system and were often sorted by types of crimes, with each court developing its own unique expertise or speciality. Local courts, especially the small rural ones that would be held at a manor house, were places where citizens attempted to resolve problems that affected them locally. These courts, like most Tudor courts, were places where the rich could expect preferential treatment. Finally, there was the Star Chamber, which was one of the highest courts in Tudor England, which derived its name from the elegantly decorated room in which it was situated. This sat at the Royal Palace of Westminster from the late 15th century. The primary function of the Star Chamber was to hear cases involving political libel, heresy, and treason. Robert Devereux, 2nd Earl of Essex, was brought before the Star Chamber on charges of treason. One of Elizabeth I's favourites, he was given a second chance. However, he was not given a third, and was subsequently executed. Minor crimes and punishment in small Tudor towns were dealt with by the Justice of the Peace at the nearest manor house, probably his own. Many crimes during the Tudor era were due to a crime committed and the law broken due to desperate acts of the poor. Each town parish was responsible for the poor and unemployed within that parish. The Justice of the Peace for each Tudor town was allowed to collect a tax from their wealthy inhabitants. This was called the poor rate, which was used to help the poor. However, towns did not accept outside poor and vagrants. They were whipped and often branded before being ejected from the town. The most common crimes of the poor were theft, cut purses, begging, poaching, adultery, debtors, forgers, fraud, murder, treason and rebellion, and heresy. Lesser punishments for committing crime included whipping. Every town had a whipping post. The victim was chained to the post and whipped. You could be whipped for stealing a loaf of bread. Branding with a hot iron was used to burn letters into the skin of offenders' hands, arms or cheeks. A murderer would be branded with the letter M, vagrants and beggars with the letter V, and thieves with the letter T. For various small crimes, the pillory was used. This was for maximum humiliation and discomfort. The pillory was a T-shaped block of wood with holes for the hands and head. The person being punished would have to stand in the device in the middle of the market to be mocked by passers-by. The stocks were used in the same way as the pillory, except that with stocks the feet were tied up. The stocks were a block of wood with 2 holes for your feet to go into. Local people threw rubbish and rotten eggs at people in the stocks. The ducking stool was used for those accused of witchcraft, and they were dunked in the local river to see if they were innocent or guilty. If they floated, they were considered guilty and burnt at the stake or hung. If they sank, they were innocent but died anyway by drowning. Either way, they died. The brank, or the skull's bridle, was a punishment for women who gossiped or spoke too freely. It was a large iron frame placed on the head of the person, forming a type of cage. There was a metal strip on the brank that went into the mouth and was either sharpened to a point or covered with spikes, so that if they tried to talk, they got severe injuries in the mouth. The drunken's cloak was a punishment for public drunkenness. The drunk was forced to wear a barrel and wander through the town while the villagers laughed at him. Holes were cut into the barrel for the person's hands and head, causing it to become like a heavy, awkward shirt or cloak. Theft was more serious, and for stealing anything over 5 pence could result in hanging. Even small crimes such as stealing birds' eggs could result in the death sentence. Begging was a serious crime during the Tudor era. The Tudor government made begging a crime and therefore illegal, and poor beggars would be beaten until they reached the stones that marked the town-parish boundary. The beatings given as punishment were bloody and merciless, and those who were caught continually begging would be sent to prison and even hanged as their punishment. Of course, royals and nobles were allowed a lot of liberty and had little need to commit crimes, but when it was a serious crime, like treason, they could be punished very harshly. It was common to inflict torture on those accused of treason or witchcraft. Although trials for the rich were very much in their favour, this was not the case if the accuser was the king or queen, and the accused an unwanted wife, like Anne Boleyn, or dangerous figurehead, like Mary Queen of Scots. In a Tudor trial, the accused had the burden of proving their innocence, unlike today when the accused is innocent until proven guilty. And the very basis and the design of the judicial system made proving their innocence almost impossible. The preliminary court investigated the allegations, heard testimony, and questioned, and sometimes tortured, witnesses. The indictment was taken as a more or less established fact by the trial court, not something to be challenged by the defendants on an evidentiary basis. The question before the trial court was how the accused would respond to these facts. For the most part, people believed the accused had to be guilty, or they wouldn't have been charged with the crime in the first place. Many people also believed that if a person was truly innocent, God would intercede with a miracle to prove it. Anne herself may have believed this, as evinced in her statement to William Kingston that it wouldn't rain until she was delivered from the Tower, or if she died, there would be a great punishment visited on England within 7 years. It was of course a foregone conclusion that Anne would be found guilty. Everyone knew the king's mind, and even though members of Anne's family sat on the jury, her family knew what they were expected to do to save the rest of the family, find her guilty. Anne was almost certainly innocent. The most common crimes of royalty and wealthy nobles included high treason, blasphemy, sedition, conducting a speech inciting people to rebel against the authority of a state or monarch, spying, rebellion, murder, witchcraft, and alchemy. The punishment for most of these crimes was death. There were various forms of execution, however. These punishments included execution by beheading, by burning, and the most terrible of all, punishment for high treason was to be hung, drawn, and quartered. Minor punishments would include taking the lands, titles, and wealth from those who had been found guilty of various crimes. For those of high status, execution by beheading was the most common form of execution, and it was a terrifying prospect. The Tudor executioners often took several blows before the head was finally severed, as it was in the execution of the old Countess of Salisbury. The executioner of the Mary Queen of Scots was so nervous it took several blows of the axe to sever her head from her body. Anne Boleyn was granted the services of a French executioner, and her head was severed from her body by a French sword. It was common practice for everyone to be subjected to the most public form of punishment or execution for their crimes. But for queens this was generally restricted to the members of the Tudor court and the nobles of the land, including close members of their family. But their respective executions were still witnessed by several hundred spectators. Following the execution by beheading, the severed head was held up by the hair by the executioner. This tradition was not just to show the crowd the head, but also to show the head of the victim to the crowd and to its own body. Consciousness remains for at least 8 seconds after beheading, until the lack of oxygen causes unconsciousness and merciful death. The head of a traitor would be placed on a stake and displayed in a public place, such as on the ramparts of a castle or such prominent spots like London Bridge. Life in Tudor England was chronicled by William Harrison, and this included details of Tudor crime and punishment. The most dreadful punishment of being hung, drawn and quartered was described by William Harrison as follows. The greatest and most grievous punishment used in England for such an offence against the state is drawing from the prison to the place of execution upon a hurdle or sled, where they are hanged till they be half dead, and then taken down and quartered alive. After that, their members and bowels are cut from their bodies and thrown into a fire, provided near hand and with their own sight, even for the same purpose. The punishment of being burnt to the stake is another Tudor punishment and was much favoured by the Catholic Inquisition and Queen Mary I, Bloody Mary. Being burnt to the stake was a most terrible death. Tudor executioners sometimes showed mercy to their victims by placing gunpowder at the base of the stake, which helped the victim to a swifter and less painful death. The only other respite from the excruciating pain of being burnt to death was if the victims died of suffocation through smoke inhalation and lack of oxygen. Less common punishment was to be pressed or crushed to death, or even boiled alive in a big vat of hot boiling water. Finally, public punishment held another purpose. They were considered entertainment, and a public execution was an event not to be missed. People would queue through the night to get the best places, as they might today for a big concert or to see tennis at Wimbledon. There was always pie sellers, ale merchants and producers of execution memorabilia. They all did a good trade. Treated as a day out, there was often a general party atmosphere, culminating with seeing a Tudor celebrity meet their end, often with a farewell speech before they departed this world. Tudor Crime and Punishment in 15 minutes. What do you think about Tudor crime and punishment? Do you think the law needed to be harsh for fear of lawlessness and social disorder? Do you feel it was just a way of controlling the masses? Was it fair and equal across the social spectrum? Is the law completely fair across the social spectrum even today? Let us know in the comments below. Please subscribe, like or click on the bell to be notified of other upcoming videos. Thank you for watching. See you soon.